expanded runway, so that triggered the requirement to undergo a federal environmental impact study. Even though they didn't own the airport, they weren't going to build the airport with their own money, although they contributed. But even though it was the county's airport, the study under NEPA was necessary because the FAA would have had to take the action to approve the runway. That's typical. So if an interstate highway is going to be built, it's going to be done with US DOT approval, so an environmental impact statement under NEPA will be required. If a city is going to build a road that they own, that they're going to use their own money for, they're not going to use any federal money, that's not going to trigger a NEPA requirement because there's no federal agency that has to approve it. So it comes up with it comes into play with ports, airports, roads that the federal government is involved in. They're changing the approaches to the runways, and that something in air traffic control can be one of those actions that would trigger a NEPA review. It is a procedural law. It means that it requires everyone to go through a process to look at the options and analyze the environmental impacts of them. It doesn't require any particular outcome. It's not focused on getting the right answer. It's focused on making everyone go through the right process. So there's two basic forms of study. An environmental assessment is a lower level, less work involved in an environmental assessment, and there's federal laws that govern which kind of study you have to do, or an environmental impact statement. For some federal actions, you can go through a study and determine that, get a FONSI. Isn't that fun? A finding of no significant impact. So you can look at some federal actions and they can make the case that it's such a minor change that environmental study isn't really necessary. And then people with environmental interests can challenge all of these things, all of these decisions. But the real essence of NEPA is procedural. The law requires you to do the study, to do it in public, to open discussion to the public, to examine it and to challenge it. And the only thing that you have to do to come out validly at the end is have followed the process. The Clean Water Act. So this regulates point source pollution. So this is regulating people who cause pollution. Sometimes you regulate people whose land ends up with pollution, but this is the part that focuses on people who are doing things that cause pollution. Now, interestingly, we have this discussion about wetlands that comes out of this Clean Water Act. So, who's ever been involved in a project that involved filling a wetland? Like, have you had any project, any exposure to a project that involved first having to fill land with dirt to eliminate a wet area? No? No experience with that? Yeah?
I don't have any experience with it, but where I live in North Miami, and I lived in the same place before, in the same building. Before, there was a lake in front of the building. Now there's a Costco where the lake was. I mean, it was a pretty big pile of water there. I don't even know how they got rid of it, but they did. And so don't even know how they did it. It used to be an old dump there. So
yeah, there's a lot of lakes that get created to generate fill to use on roads and highways, and they don't have any natural value, so to speak. They can be refilled. I mean, you have to go through a permitting process to make sure that they're filled with clean fill, but there are all kinds of lakes all over South Florida that were dug to get lime rock for a highway, and then they get refilled later to create developable land. Well, I'm sorry you don't have a lake in front of your house anymore. But Section 404 This regulates the discharge of dredged and fill material into waters of the United States, and it gives the federal government jurisdiction over navigable waters. So navigable is something that gets litigated constantly, okay? When the EPA is being guided by a pro-development perspective, they define navigable water to pull it back so that the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers have less jurisdictional reach. And when it's being governed by a more environmentally sensitive perspective, they define navigable waters in a broad way to try to extend the regulatory reach of those agencies. But the placement of dredge material, the placement of fill material into a wetland, what you and I would think of probably as a swamp, to create a development parcel is regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers under the Clean Water Act, by the State Water Management District and Department of Environmental Protection, and can be regulated by the local government. So this is one environmental law that you encounter in a development scenario. If your land needs fill material, it triggers all of this kind of analysis. And the Section 404 part of the law, it sets goals to restore and maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Does not directly regulate groundwater contamination. Other laws do that. What's called RCRA and CERCLA. Those are things that you'll spend. We're not going to dive deeply into those. The dredge and fill regulations of the Clean Water Act, they set the standard of no net loss of wetlands. But is anybody wondering why wetlands are such a big issue in this context? When there's floods, they sheet flow, so to speak.
Well, as a natural-born Floridian, I know that the Everglades is a river flowing from the Okeechobee River. You can help me out, Mr. Water.
Not a river.
It's like a river of grass.
Waterways, yeah.
And so having the wetlands are essential to having kind of the smooth transfer. I guess floodlands is probably a pretty good one.
I mean, that's one purpose.
Yeah.
So the benefits of, so first of all, wetlands, like scientifically, have to be identified by the number of days, so to speak, the amount that they are inundated with water, the kind of plants that grow there, and the kind of soils. It takes all three. It has to be soil, plant, and intermittent flooding that have to all be found to be in place in a certain percentage in order for there to be a wetland there. But the reason that the Clean Water Act protects wetlands is because of the benefits they provide to water quality. So yes, they're there to receive floodwaters, but what happens when the water goes into a wetland is that it's cleaned, naturally cleaned by the presence of those soils and that type of vegetation, so that by the time it gets down to the groundwater, it's been cleaned of the things that hit the ground. You know, it's been cleaned of a lot of pollutants. It's a natural feature of wetlands is that they enhance the water quality through this process of percolation. They, other benefits. So intermittently wet land has other environmental benefits in addition to cleaning the water. They provide habitat for a lot of birds and wildlife that need the intermittently wet property for foraging, for resting, for nesting, all of those things. When the land is filled and it's no longer a wetland, there are a number of these sometimes protected species that now lose their habitat, they lose their resting place, they lose their ability to forage for food when it's no longer a wetland. So all these benefits, yes, it's in the Clean Water Act, and that's one primary benefit, but there are other environmental benefits to the protection of wetlands that environmentalists will fight for, apart from just making sure that they're there to clean our water.
So, there's a lot of talk about the impact that Alligator Alley had on this big flowing river,
Yes.
whether it's animals or water? Do you know, can you kind of talk to how that went through?
Well, I mean, anything, it wasn't really recognized by the development interests of the time that the water flow was even happening, because it was a very slow, very broad, difficult to observe. But it of course, it did. A road through the middle of,
Yeah.
That's true, blockade.
yeah, and it did stop the movement of animals. I mean, you know, they, in the rebuilding, when they built 75 to replace the old Alligator Alley, they put underpasses for wildlife, you know, under the road. So, yeah, it can be very disruptive. But wetlands could be an orange grove. Okay, my house is probably built in what was an old orange grove. An orange grove that gets abandoned over time could become a wetland. It depends on the soil, it depends on the vegetation, it depends on the number of days that it's wet. So there have been a lot of fights over the extent of what is a wetland and what is, you know, does it have all of those criteria in the right quantities to qualify as a wetland. But this section 404, you know, if you're involved with a project that needs to have wet land fill, you're going to have to go through this multifaceted permitting process. And there's no guarantee if you get the Army Corps permit that you're going to get the state permit and the local permit. They try to coordinate their permitting, but it doesn't work out very well. You can end up with long delays for any of the steps in this permitting process. Now, one last thing. There can be inadvertent violations of this that you think are just common sense. Someone could have a wetland in the middle of their land and they don't know it. They could have they think it's a ditch. They think it's an irrigation ditch. And why should anybody care if they fill an old drainage ditch that's on their land? So some might say that there's never an inadvertent violation. Everybody is just trying to fill the wetlands surreptitiously and get away with it. But it can be difficult to know whether a depressed patch in the middle of your property is actually a regulated wetland. It's not going to be a navigable water of the U.S., but it might be a wetland under local rules or under state rules that don't require that connection to navigable waters. Okay. So there's other federal legislation. The Endangered Species Act requires consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service to prevent harm to listed species. When an endangered species uses your land for nesting, feeding, resting, and a migratory pattern, all of those things can be enough contact with your land to require that you address endangered species in a development plan. So what do we encounter here in South Florida? Gopher tortoises,
Burrowing owls.
burrowing owls,
Are they listed?
wood stork. I don't have burrowing owls here.
Oh, you missed out. The barred owl. You got your manatee. So, I can name
And this is not a complete list. These are just ones that I've seen studied in environmental reports.
Oh, the roseated spoonbill. Roseate spoonbill? That one? It's like a pink bird with the spoonbill.
There's birds. Who's doing, you guys are doing the American Dream. Did that have an endangered, are you into it yet? I think that might have an endangered species argument associated with it.
Ooh.
Yeah, and I've heard someone say that burrowing owls are not a problem, you just a nighttime visit with a tennis racket. Isn't that horrible?
Whoa.
I've heard it said.
They're pretty cool.
That's pretty horrible. But these, you know, again, if you're in a development setting in a wild area, so to speak, you're breaking new ground, and it's not just a suburban redevelopment type of thing. You need, before you buy that land, before you get under contract, you might need to have an environmental consultant go do a survey of it to figure out if you have any of these protected species, so you know before you get contractually bound and make a big investment in property, that you're going to have protected species to deal with.
I have a question. It's a little bit on this, but a little off. If you know certain trees are protected, where would you find out what type of tree? Where would you find that information?
You would search the environmental agencies that have jurisdiction over your area. You know that. I mean, mangroves are the ones that come to mind here that you can have trouble, that can cause trouble for development, is the existence of mangroves in coastal areas. But trees, I think you have to assume that all trees are going to have to be addressed in some way. You're going to have to do a tree survey. The ones that are exotic or nuisance species, you're going to be able to remove. The ones that are not nuisance or exotic species, you're going to have to make a plan, and you're going to have to mitigate. You're going to have to, every single tree you remove, you're going to have to mitigate with trees somewhere else. You know, so it's, if you're involved in a heavily wooded site, just get the tree survey and start preparing.
Is that just a Florida thing? I mean, I'm
I
sure
don't
there's other
think so.
places, but is that a, because there are more trees on the East Coast than there were 100 years ago.
Really?
Yeah, 100 years ago, the East Coast was farmland.
Yeah.
Now those farmlands, that land has grown up into trees. So
I don't think it's just a Florida thing, because the benefits of tree canopy are true everywhere that's being urbanized, right? One effect of urbanization is the loss of canopy. So you've got heat, that pavement and buildings, they create more of a heat envelope in the environment, and trees improve the environment in that way. So loss of tree canopy is a problem everywhere.
If a tree is dying naturally, can you chop it down, or you still need permitting for it? I mean, permission to
You probably need a permit. I mean, you can probably get a permit if it's and you might or might not have to mitigate for it, because it's a hazard, the fact that it's in a condition that's hazardous. Things like that, dangerous or hazardous, or it's interfering with the foundation of a building or something. Those are all reasons that they'll allow you that they'll permit the removal of the tree, but you probably should still plan on permitting it. Yes, I have 2 terrible trees in my front yard that I wish were not there.
you can't do anything about it?
I can get a permit and probably, but I'll probably have to replace those trees because they're pretty large with 6
6 trees.
palms or more. If I wanted palms.
Really?
So I'm like, anyway.
You pay just to remove a tree. I do that all the time.
You
Yeah,
need a permit,
you need a permit, yeah.
and you need to use an actual arborist most of the time to remove the tree. But we're getting off.
Well, let's stop there.
Okay, so species. So if you've got a nice big green field or heavily wooded piece of property that you're starting to work on, hire that environmental consultant and get them out there and do a survey so you know what you're dealing with. The Clean Air Act created national air quality standards. Can you believe that it was the 1970s before we had this? Can you believe hundreds of years went by when there was no national air quality standard? It's just hard to believe. The first major environmental legislation to include a provision allowing citizen suits as an enforcement mechanism. So that was really a game changer, because citizen suits created a kind of natural enforcement that it didn't depend on a government agency spending the money to undertake enforcement itself. It allowed the citizens to step in and require the agency to do its job, basically. Now, there was legislation just adopted here in Florida that rolled back the ability a little bit of citizens to file lawsuits over development that they claimed was inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. A provision was adopted that would make them liable for the attorney's fees if they lost. So it's really being decried by growth management advocates as undercutting the value of having citizen enforcement. It's not an environmental law, it's really on the land use side, but it just shows how that, how perspective can swing on something like this. But the Clean Air Act does still allow a provision, does still allow citizen suits as an enforcement mechanism. So the federal approach of these kind of environmental schemes was to establish national substantive standards. Water can't have more than X units per Y of this contaminant. Groundwater can't have, air can't, so the federal law, the regulations implementing the federal law set these standards for pollutants and contaminants. It said clean air, clean water, it won't be clean anymore if you cross these thresholds. And then it set up a mechanism where states, through their own environmental agencies, would take those standards and adopt laws and enforcement mechanisms in their own state. It's it's not incentive-based, it's not like a new, it's very comprehensive and sort of, we're going to take control of this. The law of the land is that air operations must not breach these air quality standards, these water quality standards. There are other approaches to this that include education and incentive programs for selected industries. For example, 20 or more years ago, when the air quality was deteriorating here in Broward County because of so much traffic, there was a regulation adopted that required vapor recovery mechanisms on gas fill, spouts when you're filling gas in your car. You guys probably don't remember these accordion things that used to be on the gas. Do you remember them?
I don't know that's what they were.
I didn't think they had them that long ago.
It was probably the requirement for vapor recovery systems is what they were called. It was like rolling out. I was still county. Oh, it was probably 20 years ago. So there was the local environmental agency here knew that they had to get in front of this, so they started reaching out to all of the gas stations way, way, way in advance of any deadline, undertaking education programs to help them understand what the requirements of vapor recovery were, have them buy into the benefit, how, look, this is going to solve, really, just vapor recovery alone, removed Broward County from contaminant status on air. It was that dramatic. So they knew the regulation was coming and the regulation was going to hit, whether they did this education program or not. But the goal of the Broward County Environmental Agency at that time was not to have a big enforcement problem once the rule came into effect, but get ahead of it. So that's what they did. They spent substantial money on an education program, an outreach program, grant programs that would help the small operator to get the vapor recovery system installed, and then they had to go into an enforcement. There was a time when I did environmental enforcement for Broward County. I was the prosecutor in environmental hearings, and so we had, I had to prove that they were in violation of the law. They had their warning, the law came into effect, they didn't meet the they didn't have the vapor recovery in time, and then they would have a violation found against them and have to pay a fine. But the county didn't have to do it, didn't have to approach it that way. They could have just sat back and let the violations occur and go into an enforcement mode. But for that one, because there were benefits to Broward County and to the people of Broward County, they decided to get ahead of it. So something like that can be done for any industry if government decides to do it that way. They can identify a problem with a particular regulated industry, become partners with them, conduct an education program, and try to get them on board. So all of these federal environmental structures, there are states that adopt kind of mini versions of them. In California, for example, NEPA, the whole NEPA process has been made into a state process, and state agency actions, and local government actions have to go through CEQA or something. It's called CEQA. I can't remember the acronym now. But California adopted the NEPA concept and made it a little NEPA, it's called, in the state of California. And those kind of environmental assessments have to be done on most development projects in California, not just federal projects. So states can do this with all of these environmental programs. They can adopt state standards that kind of mesh with the federal standards. They might be more restrictive than the federal standards if there's a need in the state. I'm trying to think of an example in Florida. So the state is required to implement these federal laws anyway, but they can also tag on additional regulations that protect things that are unique about that state. You know, in Florida, our drinking water is the Biscayne Aquifer, which is not too far below the surface of the land. We have an intense interest in protecting the quality of groundwater here because that is our source of drinking water. It's not like we've got, you know, water pouring down from gorgeous lakes in the Catskills into the city or something. That's our source of drinking water. So protecting groundwater is of heightened interest here in Florida, and we'll find that's the case in the regulatory sense. And in most of these, state regulations can be more stringent than the federal. All right, I'm stopping. Airport zoning. Talk a lot about airports, but this is where it'll stop. The content will stop for the purpose of the midterm. I'm gonna make this slide deck available to you too, but just know from this slide on, I'm not